Evening, everyone. We really appreciate you all being here for our seventh Code Connection. Can you believe we are half through the year? I feel like we just started these. But thank you all for joining us for this evening's presentation on our code preview document. For those of you who may have seen our work session with City Council on Monday, this will be a similar presentation and information, but we are glad each of you are here this evening. And we are really happy to have our presenters here tonight to present this information to you. Would like to introduce our presenters from our consulting team. We have Thomas Eddington, Larry Weston, and let's see, do I have anybody else from CZB that is here with me? And then I don't think so. And then we have Christy with Code Studio, Christy Dotson with Code Studio. And I think you're it for Code Studio tonight, correct, Christy?
That is right.
Great. So Thomas, Christy, and Larry will be leading our program for this evening. And I did notice on my screen, I just want to make sure we don't have any technical difficulties, that the presentation slides just went gray. Are y'all having the same, or can you? Okay, now they're back. Okay, great. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone. Just want to make sure we don't have any technical difficulties. So with that, we're going to go ahead. We have a jammed packed presentation tonight. We want to get through all of the slides. And we will try to monitor the question and answer at the end. I do know that we have another public meeting this evening that is beginning at 5:30 for our pedestrian safety study, our drop-in open house. We will conclude this meeting tonight promptly at 6, so that any of you all wanting to attend that meeting have time to get to Unity Park for that drop-in. So you have until 7:30 for that meeting if you're trying to attend both this evening. We will record this as well, so if you need to drop off early, we'll make sure that it is posted on the website by the end of the week. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our consulting team and let them take it from here. Thank you, Thomas.
Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, and thanks for kind of setting us up with a well-done script. We're trying to keep this very much in line with what you all presented to the council so that everybody's hearing the same thing. So thanks for that. Again, Larry and Christy are here. If folks have questions as we go through this, I think, Shannon, you want them to put them into the Q&A chat. Is that where you prefer they put them?
Yes, and we want to try to keep the questions to the topic at hand if we can. So if there are specific questions with the code preview document, we'll be happy to try to answer those during the presentation. If you have specific questions about other things planning related, I would encourage you to email us at planning@greenvillesc.gov, or you can email any member of our planning staff. But because we do have a packed program tonight, would like to keep the question and answers specifically to the code document the code preview document that you're about to present.
Great. Okay, so I will kick this off. So again, thanks for joining us. Tonight's presentation is an update on the Greenville Development Code and kind of an introduction, a code preview document. As we begin tonight, it's important to understand that this document is not the draft code. This is really a document that will help frame what that draft code will look like, what it will include, and really this is for discussion purposes. It'll provide some examples and some illustrations that will highlight some of the important components of the forthcoming code. Next slide. We always want to give you guys an update on the schedule. So as you can see here, we're in early mid-July. And so much of the framework work is done. We will be completing the area development plans the middle of this month and getting them out to the community in early August. And then, of course, you can see districts and uses, development standards, et cetera, some of the core components of the code. They'll be coming out in spurts, in chunks, if you will, in August, September, October. And again, the intent is to get the final development code, a draft development code, to you all by the end of the year in December. So maintaining the schedule that we had set out early. Document structure. We'll quickly review the guidance provided through GVL 2040, the comprehensive plan that laid the framework for this. It will provide examples and illustrations of how the ideas and tools will work in different contexts. And at the end of the presentation this evening, we'll finish up with some timelines and some additional required actions that are a little bit more specific than what we just outlined in the prior slide. Next slide. So this is the new Growth and Development Code that puts into action what GBL 2040, the comprehensive plan, recommended after its adoption in early 2021. Next slide. So again, in early 2021, the City of Greenville adopted the comprehensive plan GBL 2040. This is based on that. This is a plan that will guide development and public decisions for at least the next decade or until such time as a new plan is updated. GBL 2040 recommends, and its vision requires, important actions. Among them is that we provide input to shape private sector real estate development in a way that helps Greenville meet its ambitious goals for growth, development, economic vibrancy, transportation and mobility, affordable housing, open space protection, and overall quality of life. So some of the code, some of the sections of code that address some of those issues were actually started by the planning staff last summer. And many of those text amendments that some of you may be aware of will find their way into the new code, perhaps in slightly different format, of course, but many of those issues are still relevant and they'll find their way into the new code. The GBL 2040 does prioritize producing affordable housing, maintaining opportunities for affordable housing, preserving open space, improving modes of transportation, all of this while continuing to grow at a fairly rapid pace. And preservation of neighborhoods was a fundamental component that was outlined in GBL 2040 as well. What this really means is that Greenville will make a shift from kind of a suburban form character context that is the result of a suburban code to one that'll be shaped by a more urban code. The new development code will be much more urban in nature, especially around corridors and nodes. Next slide. So, over the course of the past 50 years, development patterns took advantage of open greenfield land for development and really prioritized a convenience for motorists, the automobile. With a few notable exceptions, most of the land developed in Greenville was built out after the Second World War when mass automobile ownership transformed transportation systems as well as the real estate development. Local roads, especially those built by federal and state partners, are quite wide. They have a number of lanes and they have very little pedestrian infrastructure. These corridors were designed to move cars. Buildings were set back from the roads and parking lots separated the two. But after GVL 2040, how will we grow? So the nodes and the corridors will have to fundamentally change. The appearance of them, their character, their context will change. There will be less parking and less surface parking, more structured parking. There will be greater building mass and scale to accommodate the new square footage and greater heights for some of those buildings. Parts of Greenville that are planned as nodes may start to resemble parts of downtown, kind of, mixed-use commercial districts. And while this will mostly take place under the context of redevelopment, it'll be gradual. It won't take place overnight, but you will see many of these nodes and some of the corridors change substantially over the course of the next couple of decades. Existing residential neighborhoods, as we have maintained in GVL 2040 and in this presentation, will continue to remain dominated primarily by single-family housing. Again, largely unchanged. Next slide. So the node corridor and neighborhood framework, it's not just an aesthetic preference. It does provide for better aesthetics, but it's not solely based on aesthetics. It establishes a system that ultimately supports the clearly stated priorities of the comprehensive plan. Remember, land supply is constrained. As we preserve vacant land and we steer growth to the designated nodes and corridors, some of those land supplies will be constrained, prices will go up. To accommodate, we'll look to higher densities and mixed uses in the nodes and along the corridors. Hopefully, concentrating jobs and services and other amenities throughout the city in these nodes. Dependence on cars ideally will be reduced. Other transportation modes will become more safe, reliable, and accessible. And most of this, if not all of this, is the result of providing density in these specific places that allow for walkable communities and allow for this kind of concentration. Next slide. So first, the current development code, it's worth noting, does not clearly push new development into a few areas. Rather, it facilitates suburban development in many places. Secondly, it very easily allows for redevelopment in existing single unit detached neighborhoods, something that can change the character and allows residential demand to be siphoned out of areas where higher densities should occur. Thirdly, it lacks the right tools to respond to creative ideas from the private sector or guide private sector to what GVL 2040 intends. Again, concentrated development areas. Right now, there's only one zoning district in Greenville that can appropriately accommodate a truly urban project, and that is the C4 zone. C4 is the zone that is the zone that addresses all of the downtown area, for example. It's just that one. The new code will have different mixed-use zoning designations that do much the same at reduced heights and densities. Fourth, the current code is has some inefficiencies that means we're continually editing and working around the regulations to suit each individual development rather than addressing it holistically. Right now, rezonings and plan development approaches kind of are employed as band-aids in a system that lacks the right fundamental tools and rules. That'll change with the new code. Rezoning right now to other insufficient or less than opportune zoning districts doesn't really address root causes that the Planning Commission and the planning staff have to address right now with regard to development. And the hope is with the new development code, we won't need to see nearly as many patchworks and fixes over the course of the next few years. Of course, codes are evolving documents, they'll change, but given how much information we've had over the course year from text amendments and others, all of that will be incorporated into the new code just to get it right from day one. So it's a lot of work being put into one document, but there's a number of years of inputs that are actually helping guide this document. Next slide. So tonight, what we want to make sure is that we stress that these concepts will allow for you, the stakeholders, allow for the planning commissioners, allow for city council to understand how the new code will work. Again, in totality, all of these concepts illustrate a path toward a highly livable city. That was the fundamental premise behind GVL 2040. Next slide. So we've got a few concepts that we wanted to outline here. I think there's about maybe 7, 8, or 9. The first one is the existing physical character. So again, within the residential neighborhoods, that will be preserved. Where existing patterns are conducive to expanding residential opportunities in the neighborhoods, maybe that's to accommodate an accessory dwelling unit, those changes can take place under rules that will limit the impacts to adjacent properties and or the neighborhood. With regard to corridors, they'll be allowed to develop at greater heights and scale to accommodate demand for new development. Taller buildings with a mix of uses will become the norm rather than single-story buildings or two-story buildings along the corridors. Next slide. Nodes. Again, some people don't necessarily love that term, but it is an applicable term. It is a concentration of activity, a growth district, a mixed-use hub. Think of it how you will, but those will be allowed to develop at greater heights and scales than the corridors. So these are where we really want to see those neighborhood centers, those business centers really start to take off. They'll be zoned accordingly for that. With those changes, with those increased densities and heights, we do want to make sure that the transitions between the residential developments and the more intense commercial developments or the nodes, these mixed use areas, will be managed intentionally. And certainly Buffer and transition zones will be defined in detail and required where commercial uses directly abut residential housing, something that we've worked really closely with many of the neighborhood groups to address, and that those kinds of buffer and transition zones will be baked right into the new code. Go to the next slide. So infill is possible within existing residential neighborhoods, but it'll have to match the existing neighborhood physical character. So with the new code, it will be much more in context with development. Infill development will be much more in context with the existing development in the neighborhoods. We've worked closely with Code Studio, with Greenville planning staff and others to make sure that we've looked at the details and some of the issues that have challenged the community over the past couple of years. So really what we have found is that form and character of the new buildings are two of the components that we really have to address in detail with regard to infill development. And also missing middle housing. This is, where appropriate, allowing for taller and mid-scale housing types, maybe like duplexes and triplexes, townhouses, and even small apartment buildings. These could be allowed near the edges of existing neighborhoods, kind of as a transition between them and maybe a node, a development area. And this would start to allow for kind of that housing ladder, different housing rents and or prices that would allow for mixed income, mixed development. Again, recognizing that we have to pay special attention to the form in these areas because we have heard from the neighborhood groups that is what matters more significantly. Next slide. So affordable housing is more likely to be distributed across the community with the new code. It'll be through development initiatives and bonuses, and affordable housing opportunities will be encouraged everywhere in the city. You can see on the right-hand side of this slide, there's a bit of an example with regard to a density bonus, a height bonus. It could be, for example, if we're in a mixed-use zone of 3 stories, it could be an allowance of 1 or 2 additional stories subject to an inclusionary zoning policy. Inclusionary zoning meaning a percent of that new development would be dedicated for affordable or workforce housing. So we'll work to incorporate that into the code to make sure that it's easy to address affordable housing in the nodes and along some of the corridors. Next slide. So one of the items we discussed most during the text amendments that we understand you all discussed most during the text amendments that were addressed late last year, early this year, was stormwater. And so it was really about managing stormwater and protecting the neighborhoods from stormwater runoff. So from the new code's perspective, net increases of runoff from the new projects will have to be managed on the property that is creating the runoff. And preservation of mature trees and natural landscapes will be prioritized on large development sites. Again, that kind of connects back to your existing tree ordinance and some of the early stormwater regulations that have been discussed. Next slide. So this is about how to put the concepts into action. So districts will be created with the right fundamental rules in terms of height and scale and setbacks and design. The new zoning districts will be carefully calibrated. There will be more of them to address the nuances of development throughout the city and to ensure that the city gets more high quality development of the right type and with the right physical characteristics in the right locations. Transitions, again, we'll be paying much more close attention to the transitions between not only districts, but uses and types of uses as well. Again, commercial abutting residential, there will be a definitive transition zone, buffer zone between the two. That kind of ties into the second one, buffers, which is really how we provide both a material. It could be fencing, it could be walls, it could be landscaping, dual rows of trees, etc., between uses that may not be compatible. Stormwater, we just addressed that. That'll have to be addressed on site. There will be some recommendations for best practices, including some green infrastructure and bioswale opportunities. And then affordable housing, again, it was seemingly the number one issue that emerged from GVL 2040 when we worked on the comprehensive plan, and the community noted a significant need for affordable housing. So we'll want to ensure opportunities for different housing types in different locations throughout the city. Remember, zoning can't resolve all of the affordable housing issues, but it is an opportunity to zone correctly, to partner with developers, to begin to address it. It's a tool. It's one tool in the toolbox. And finally, open space will work with development bonuses for developers who can contribute to open space goals, whether that could be funding for additional open space, acquisition, trails, connectivity to Swamp Rabbit Trail and or other spurs, and or providing additional open space on their site. That'll be defined within the code. Next slide. Right now, single unit detached housing is the land use that covers the largest amount of area in the city, the largest amount of land within the city. That'll continue to be the case in the future. The preservation of the character of these residential areas is a priority of GVL 2040. So even as the city becomes more urban, we'll see those neighborhoods protected. But mid-scale housing, such as duplexes, maybe up to small apartment buildings, maybe 8, 10, 12 units, will be allowed on the edges of the growth nodes or kind of between the growth nodes and the neighborhoods where appropriate, to help transition those areas. And then we will incorporate mixed use zoning. You can start to see on the very right-hand side there, MX districts, mixed use zoning districts. Will allow for vertical and horizontal mixed use development, and they'll allow for slightly greater heights. We'll try to keep the new code. Again, we are creating additional districts. We'll try to keep that as straightforward as possible. For example, an MX3 would be a mixed use with a maximum of 3 stories before bonus allowances, maybe for affordable housing or open space protection. So that'll start to emerge in the new code. Again, from a graphic perspective, we'll illustrate it and include the narrative with area and bulk standards and dimensions. Next slide. So how do we apply the new concepts? You can go to the next slide. The next, I think, 3 slides kind of show how these new code tools, districts, transitions, buffers, stormwaters, et cetera, will work within the various geographies within the community. So this is kind of an illustration to show how the new code would be applied in neighborhoods. So you'll start to see in the new code recommendations for the transitions, very specific recommendations. Again, buffer, stormwater, and recommendations for bonus opportunities for affordable housing and open space. That will be incorporated directly into the code with regard to, say, neighborhood districts. If you go to the next one, many of these, next slide, many of these similar items will be applied to the nodes as well. It'll be at a different scale. It'll be with different numerics and metrics because the nodes are the growth districts. And so there will be greater allowances in these areas. And I think the final slide we have here is for the corridors. Again, not to the same extent, not to the same height, not to the same density as, say, the nodes, but greater allowances than what you see today. So all of that will be incorporated into the code from both development standards and graphic standards and metric standards. You can go to the next slide. So as we think about this new code, what it might look like, you can go to the next slide. We know that this is going to be, as Shannon noted today, we're about halfway through code connections this year, about halfway through the work on the code this year. And so certainly none of this will be fast or easy or simple. The new code envisions a complex future with that requires matching complexity in thinking, organizing, planning, and execution to achieve the goals. And so what you see here is where we're taking the concepts outlined in GVL 2040. We'll be working through the 5 character development plans that we should have in the hands of City Hall in August, and then take that information and carry it forward to the code where we start to get into the specifics. Again, it's not just one task to get to a code. We tried to ensure that we started with the comprehensive plan, we moved to the more detailed small area planning component into the code. Once the code is in place, remember, inclusionary zoning, the requirements for, say, affordable housing is not something that is that can be required. It can be incentivized through bonuses, heights, density, etc. But that is to say that it kind of becomes a bit of a reactive measure. And so code can't do everything. There will be the need for additional programs, additional monies, additional funding for capital improvements to make sure that the new code coincides with what what City Hall and what other entities are trying to do to ensure the actualization of GVL 2040, the comp plan. So again, one component, we still have more of the proactive side, the funding that'll come from City Hall. I think we have one more slide. Yeah, this is just the timeline. So this is where we're going. Remember, things will start to amp up in August as we get the draft code out, the first portion of the draft code out to staff for review. We'll also be reviewing the 5 character development plans in August at the next Code Connection meeting. And then really between September and December, we'll address different sections of the new code. And so kind of development standards, we'll have some districts and mapping, we'll have administrative review. It'll come out in chunks for review, but most of that will take place between late August and November. And then the intent is to get the draft code into your hands in late December, and then we've got about 3 months to work with the Planning Commission and City Council. So still a pretty aggressive schedule. A lot of work has been done. A lot of work still needs to be done, but we are on schedule, and we look forward to delivering that draft code in December. I think that's the last slide that we had. Tried to get through that in about 30 minutes. I think we succeeded. And Shannon, I don't know if you have any questions or if you need additional detail from us, or if we want to go to some of the questions in the Q&A.
Well, before we get into the Q&A, I have a few questions just that wanted to ask to make sure that our audience tonight is able to hear that. So, Thomas, if we could go back and spend a little more time on the different code districts that you're looking at, and maybe Christy can speak to this too, about how we are looking at much larger number of districts and some mixed districts, and what you all hope that we can accomplish with that. For those in the audience who may not have been a part of our previous sessions, we do have limited zoning districts in the city, and we have no current mixed use districts, which many communities do have. So if we could spend a little more time on why we think additional districts are important and what we hope to accomplish with those additional districts, I think it would be helpful for our audience this evening.
Sure. Christy, can I turn this one over to you so they don't have to hear me continue to go on and on?
Yeah, that's great. So I think as a good example, looking at the RC and mixed use districts. So today, there are a few RM districts. So you have RM1, 1.52, and that's really the extent of your multifamily districts. And there's no real differentiation between those, or if you want to put commercial in there, you have to go to your commercial district. As Shannon mentioned, there's no real mixed use district. And so what we're going to be giving you in the new code are districts that are not only mixed use, they're mixed use and they have different scales associated with them. And then separate from that are apartment districts. So RC, for example, is shorthand for residential community. And those are meant to be multifamily districts, things like apartments or condos. And then there are different heights associated within that district category. So you could have one that's a maximum of 2 stories, a maximum of 3, a maximum of 5. And so you then have a set of tools for multifamily districts that are more right-sized and more urban and less suburban than your current RM districts. And then in addition to that, you have a palette of mixed use districts. So mixed use 2-story, mixed use 3-story, mixed use 5-story, for example. And that's just your sort of typical mixed use. So you have the option of doing some commercial development like retail, like restaurants on the bottom floor of those, or the entire building could be office in a mixed use district. So it gives you some more flexibility, and the metrics associated with those will also build in a lot of the urban design issues to make sure that the buildings are, the form of them and the way they address the public realm, that they're reinforcing these urban design issues that make that Greenville really wants to see in the community. And then even on top of that, we have some even more nuance within these mixed use districts. So this MXS, for example, that's something that would probably occur at key intersections in nodes, and that S stands for shop front. And that means that there's more attention paid in that particular district to that ground floor. We want to make sure that it has a lot of glass and transparency so that it feels like a very walkable, pedestrian oriented place. And there's extra attention and extra metrics paid to that ground floor. So that really shows that, you no longer have these sort of blunt instruments, but you get a much broader palette that more specifically addresses all of the different contexts that exist throughout Greenville.
Thank you, Christy. We really appreciate that answer to kind of give us a little bit more detail concerning what we're trying to do with some of the districts. Also, Thomas, if we could, let's talk a little bit about stormwater. I think there are a lot of people who are concerned really about the stormwater, and I know that we're trying to look at some options related to stormwater. Can we talk a little bit more about the work that you all are doing related to stormwater? Because I think probably one of the things that the city hears the most about with new projects is stormwater. Can we go into a little more detail related to the stormwater?
Sure. So, right now the stormwater is addressed in the code, but it's addressed as kind of an attachment to the code as part of the engineering design specifications manual. And so we're also updating that, working with the planning and engineering departments to make sure that that gets updated. And so right now, to your point, there's a little bit of, there's a lack of clarity with regard to how to address some stormwater. As we've been working with staff on stormwater, we're starting to look at more definitive requirements for when a stormwater issue has to be addressed. So whether it's maybe in the past it hasn't been at time of redevelopment. So for example, if there was a property that was maybe an abandoned restaurant, for example, with a large parking lot, significant stormwater runoff, that would be something that in the new code that we would have to address as part of redevelopment. And much of that might be, are there opportunities for bioswales? Are there opportunities for different kinds of stormwater basins depending on the configuration of the land? Does some of the pavement perhaps need to be removed, especially around the perimeter of the site, to make space for stormwater collection? And so looking at the timing when we address the issues of stormwater, especially for redevelopment, as well as different best practices for both green infrastructure and basic capital improvement infrastructure. All of that's being taken into account with regard to stormwater.
Thank you, Thomas. And also another issue that I think is important to people is transitions. One thing that we don't currently address anywhere really within our ordinance is the concept of transitions. We talk a little bit about buffers, and I see Christy nodding her head. We have something about buffers, but we don't really talk about transitions. And I think one of the ways that we best transition between uses is either through different uses or through space itself. So do you all mind explaining a little bit more about how you envision transitions in the new code?
Christy, do you want to start that?
Sure. And I think the way that Shannon, you outline those are really the two types of tools we're thinking about. The one set of tools is truly through space and what it means when a commercial or a mixed use property backs up to a single family property and what needs to happen at that interface. And that's one type. And the second type is through a land use transition. And that is, maybe a parcel or two between those two gets a different land use. And what we mean by that is, a good example is one of our middle scale districts. So you have single family, and you have a couple parcels that is something like a fourplex or even a duplex. So that sort of next incremental scale up and then it goes to the mixed use either node or corridor. And so those are the two types of transitions we're thinking about. Something that would traditionally be called buffers and that exists within the space when a more commercial and residential property abut one another, and then an actual land use transition. And so there will be a set of tools for each of those, and they will be specific to different contexts. So in areas where those land use transitions already exist, or they make sense, or neighborhoods are more amicable to those edge properties having that land use transition, then that tool will be used. And when that tool isn't necessarily an option, maybe the single family and commercial directly abut one another today, and that's kind of the way that community wants to stay, then we want to make sure that there are tools in place to make sure that that buffer is treated appropriately, and that there are things like landscaping, there are setbacks for how far the building needs to be, and even how the height has to transition from this larger, taller, mixed-use building, and how that has to step down in height as it gets closer to the traditional neighborhoods. And so those are types of tools that we will have, and there'll be different flavors of each of those tools within the code. So for example, some of your corridors have really shallow parcels. And so that just inherently, because they're shallow parcels, you need a different set of tools to address those buffers. You have less space, they're less deep parcels. And so we want to make sure there are buffers that are sized for more shallow corridors. And then there are other corridors that have really deep parcels. And so that is going to require a different set of tools. And so not only are there the buffer type tools and the land use type tools, but there are actually different flavors within those to address the different types of development patterns that you have around the city.
Thank you, Christy. And Thomas, I wanted to also just ask if you or Larry or Christy could address, when it comes to putting Greenville 2040 into action, what does this zoning code do and what does this zoning code not do?
So I could start, certainly. So what it does do is it satisfies the first step to go from a non-binding document, your comprehensive plan, to a binding, a regulatory document. So it kind of it sets the tone for providing the teeth to the code. I'm sorry, the teeth to the plan, right? Because the plan is a vision, the plan has priorities and goals, but this actually provides teeth for that plan. So it's the first step. So number one, what it does is it does allow for the city to partner with developers, again, in a node to partner to do more than what is allowed to date, but also it provides breaks, stops to preserve the neighborhoods and the character of the single family neighborhoods that we heard throughout GVL 2040 they wanted protected. So what it doesn't do, though, that's pretty much the extent of what code does, right? It's a reactive measure. You, inside City Hall, wait for developers to come in, and then they have to meet the zoning code. So it's kind of a bit of a reactive measure for a city in many ways, right? It's proactive to actually get it done, but it's reactive in how it operates. What it doesn't do is it doesn't always say what should be done or what we're willing to pay for, right? That actually has to come from inside City Hall, from the developers themselves, from the nonprofit community, the philanthropic community, the foundations, where they say we're willing to put our money toward something. For example, it could be we're willing to put our money toward an extension to the Swamp Rabbit Trail. We're willing to put our money toward a new park, the construction of a new park in an area that's starting to see more robust growth. So it doesn't do that. It doesn't provide money. It doesn't provide the direction with regard to where money should be focused. That still comes from, again, inside City Hall, the private world, foundations, and philanthropy. This addresses and reacts to development activity on the private side. Larry, Christy, did I miss anything there?
No, I think I would just note, though, that it's very clear from the slides that the participants are able to see that while these slides aren't the code, they will give you an idea of what the new code will look like and feel like. It'll be a lot clearer. It'll be a lot easier to access. It'll be a lot more directive. It should cut down on the timing of the development processes that are taking place now, and it should be a code that would be accepted and appreciated by everyone who uses it, developers, neighborhood, and the city itself. So I would just make that point, but no, you've done a great job of explaining that.
Well, great, thank you. And I know one thing I'm glad you hit on that, Larry, is Christy. I think, would you mind telling people how you kind of intend to format the code? I know that it's intended to be very different than our existing code, and I think Larry already kind of alluded to that. If we could just get a little more detail on what people can expect when we actually see the code document itself.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I would also point folks back to some of the previous Code Connect webinars we've done where we've used example codes from previous communities. So of course, we're making the format and the graphics very specific to Greenville, but it will give you a good idea for what those pages will look like. And really specifically, I would like to talk about the districts and the metrics that get applied to those districts. So instead of the code, today you go online, you have a few images here and there, or a few diagrams here and there, but it's mostly text, and it's almost like a word problem, right? You have to read the text and sort of build a picture in your mind of what you're allowed to develop on the property. And the new code really is image and diagram driven. So every district, for example, will start off with 4 diagrams, and it shows you what you can do on your lot, what your setbacks look like, what your massing has to look like, and then what we call activation. So what your windows and doors and the transparency. So none of that really says you must adhere to this architectural style. We're certainly not, dictating architectural style, but we do want to illustrate the requirements. We want to give you those requirements in diagrams, and then on those diagrams will be labels that point you back to your metrics. So things like setbacks. So you'll have a diagram and you'll have a little label on there, and it'll say, here is where your setback is, and here's what your setback needs to be. 10 feet, for example, it'll have that. And then attached, sort of to the end of all those district pages. So each of the pages will have a set of diagrams and a set of metrics, and it's organized in diagrams and tables. So it should be fairly easy to follow along with. After that, we have what we call our rules of interpretation. And so that tells you, okay, well, height means different things to different people. And in those rules of interpretations, it's really done the same way. So we have a picture, and then we tell you exactly what we mean when we say height. Here's how height needs to be measured, and at what point in the building, and at what point, not every piece of land is flat. So how do we accommodate for things like that? And so it's done in a way that shows you a graphic and then gives you a set of rules after that graphic for how each of these metrics are to be measured. So it's a lot easier to follow along when you have those diagrams and labels really pointing and illustrating how these wonky ideas in zoning happen in real life.
Because zoning can be fun.
It can be really fun, guys, I'm telling you.
So we say.
Be fun. Yes, it is. Okay. So moving on, there is some question, and I want to get into if we could, Thomas or Larry, answer about that, the process for the comprehensive plan and the difference between the zoning ordinance and the comprehensive plan, and nodes that were defined in the comprehensive plan, and whether those are open to change in the future. Can we please go through the difference between what we did through the comprehensive plan and what we will do here through the zoning ordinance?
Sure. So I think so. If the question is, can the nodes change, morph, evolve? Yes. So we identified about, I think it was 11 nodes in the comprehensive plan. And certainly, as we look to build out the actual district mapping, the zoning code, we're looking at those as the logical nodes. As we've been working through it, certainly we're starting to get a little bit more detail in terms of where are the exact parcel lines, where are the boundaries, et cetera, right? And so those nodes will morph, they'll change a little bit. And some nodes may get added and some could get removed, right? But that is kind of an evolving process as we really look at the detail on the ground. Remember, in the comprehensive plan, those were recommended kind of as at about 35,000 feet. Those were nodes that were recommended. As we get into the detail, yeah, you'll definitely see some changes in how those are geographically outlined.
Thank you, Thomas. And I would just, for the benefit of the entire group that's joining us this evening, we are required under state law to do a major update to our comprehensive plan every 10 years. And a minor update in 5 years. So believe it or not, we are only probably about 2.5 years away from another new planning process to do a minor update to Greenville 2040. The beauty of that, though, is that planning is always evolving, that we're always responding to things that are happening in real world time. And so things change, conditions change. You know, we experienced during Greenville 2040 the pandemic, and none of us had seen that coming. And you know, it did kind of change the course a little bit of how the comprehensive plan evolved. So I think it's great that, you know, planning documents should be reviewed periodically. And I think every 5 years is an accurate time frame for that, to make sure that they are staying up to date with current trends and context within the community. The next question that I have for you is really an interesting one, because it has to do with annexation. And does the code say anything about annexation and how annexed areas with existing development will be assigned a district? Will it be based on existing character, or is there potential to identify new extensions of corridors or nodes?
So that's a good question. So the code itself doesn't speak to annexation, but what I will say is this. It's an interesting question, because one of the character development plans that we're working on is kind of the South Augusta, Pleasantburg, Malden area, right? And so this is an area that is bifurcated by both city and county, and done by design to start to look at that area in collaboration with what the county's doing down there. In that particular area, right now, much of the zoning is either commercial C2 or C3, local or regional commercial down there. And so on both sides of the boundary line. So as we're working through that character development plan, we've been fortunate to have the county planners on our representative, part of our representative group that has been helping us create that plan. And so we are starting to look over boundaries. So in that particular area, we'll create a plan in conjunction with the county that starts to look at, hey, this is what we would like to see in this area, a more urban entrance to the city, and or if you're looking at it from the county's perspective, a more urban entrance into the county down near the Technical and Aviation Center down there. And so we are starting to look at that. Again, the code doesn't speak to annexation, but we're trying to address it with how we will zone the boundaries of the city to ensure that they have some correlation to what's going on in the county. So that's kind of an indirect answer, but no, doesn't address annexation, but we're trying to address compatible land uses along that boundary, just so that it makes common sense at the end of the day.
Thank you, Thomas. And then also, can you spend some time on the specific affordable housing incentives? And I think we need to stick directly to incentives for the code.
So right now, what we're starting to think about in terms of affordable housing is, if we are, for example, in I think I kind of addressed this a little bit, but we'll go into a bit more detail. If we're in an MX3 zone, for example, a mixed use three-story zone, that would mean that by right, you're allowed up to 3 stories. What we're looking at are these development bonuses, height bonuses, that would allow for additional height subject to the inclusion of affordable housing. Again, we can't require it, but we can incentivize it with the additional stories. And so if you were in an MX3 and there was an allowance for an additional 2 stories, subject to, say, the provision of, we're working out the metrics, the exact numbers, the percents, but subject to the provision of, say, 10 or 15 or 20% affordable housing, that would be an allowance that wouldn't have to go back to a planning commission or back to a city council review. It would be basically be a bonus by right. And so that would be an MX3 with a bonus of 2 stories, for example. And so the intent is to make it as understandable and easy and easily accessible in the code, so that it doesn't become a kind of a drawn out or kind of subjective review. It's very objective. As long as it's this percent of affordable housing, you would get the 2 stories. We have to determine the exact AMI, the area median income. We have to kind of work through some of those numbers, but that's the intent right now, is to look at height. for affordable housing. Again, this would likely be in the nodes, maybe some corridors, but primarily the nodes.
Thank you, Thomas. And now this is a specific engineering question. And so sometimes I like to play a plangineer, but I'm not sure. We may have to get back to our constituent that asked this question this evening. But how can you preserve existing trees when underground water retention tanks fill the area under a development?
Okay, so I am not an engineer either, but I can tell you this. The intent is to look at a site holistically. So for example, if there's maybe a 5-acre site that's being explored for maybe a subdivision for single family or duplex or townhouses, whatever the case may be, to start to look at that site, identify where trees are that we'd want to preserve. The intent would be to maybe allow for some variances to where the lots are located, to allow for some lots to be moved around in an effort to allow the right density on that particular property pursuant to the code, but protect, say, a grove of trees. So in a perfect world, if we're successful with that, the grove of trees, the trees themselves, would remain in their natural condition. So ideally, their water supply, their retention would remain untouched. If it's a smaller piece of property, that becomes a bit of a different animal, right? Because it may be the requirement that if you do have to save trees on a smaller piece of property, that you would be required to incorporate some retention container. Could be, again, there are different kinds of concrete and other plastic kinds of containers that would funnel the water to a different area of the site. But on smaller sites, that does get a little bit more challenging, right? You have to be very cognizant of where runoff ends up so that it doesn't, say, flood the trees and or deprive them of water that they were otherwise getting. So it might require additional technical engineering examination. But large sites, cluster the development, preserve the trees. That would be the recommendation.
Great. Thank you, Thomas. And our final question for the evening is that we talked and addressed edges or neighborhoods for infill housing, but what about infill for mid-block?
So is this
I know
infill?
you've worked a lot on this too. This would be about how we're going to infill in the middle of the block, not just address the edges.
Yeah, it's a good question. And, I think the root of this issue is that a lot of your neighborhoods today that are sort of on the edges of downtown have multifamily designations, but really, in actuality, they're single family neighborhoods, right? They're kind of bungalow neighborhoods, maybe mill neighborhoods that have been there for a long time, sort of smaller lots. And so part of what we're doing is looking to make sure that an appropriate district is being applied to that area. So we want to make sure that the development that does come in is of appropriate scale. And one way we're doing that is we're actually giving you better tools. So then that means we're giving you better districts. So, we're giving you a smaller size single family district. So in some of those areas, it may be that they get the sort of small lot single family and it more matches the on the ground character. In some of those neighborhoods that maybe have a lot of existing duplexes, triplexes, but they look like houses, right? They're house scale, but they're not exactly single family houses. And we're going to have a district for that. And so that would be the district that's applied in that area based on the character on the ground. So really, it's looking at a lot of these existing areas, and in places where you have a lot of those house scale, duplexes, triplexes, you're going to have a district that will allow new development that will match that character, but won't be too large or too out of scale, which I know is some of the issues that you're having today. So really, it's going to be based on what's on the ground, and then it's going to be paired with making sure that you have those tools that will be more appropriately applied.
Well, thank you all so much. We really appreciate this. We got through the questions, and I appreciate everybody's participation this evening. And we're right at the end of time. So before we leave, I just want to give a couple of informational announcements. Our next Code Connection session will be on the second Wednesday in August, which I believe is August the 10th at 5 p.m. So be here again at that time. And we hope you'll all join us then for our next Code Connection session in August. And our current schedule is to try to have the draft ready for public release for everyone to review and have plenty of time to review before we go through the adoption process in the spring as of December and sometime early December. I don't want to give a specific date because then I'll get it wrong and then I'll be in trouble. So so with that, I know some people probably want to head over to Unity Park for the pedestrian study drop-in meeting, but Larry, Thomas, Christy, any final comments or thoughts this evening before we end our session for tonight?
No, just thanks for continuing to join us and stick with us for the code connections. That's the best way to kind of understand where we are before we release the code in December. So yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you all very much. Have a great evening, and we hope to see you back here in August.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thanks all.